It looks like we're going to have a repeat of last year, which is that last year the budget was approved in June. Now, the committees, I think about half of the committees have submitted their reports. The other half are still doing their hearings. Yesterday,
like 31 out of 61 or 35.
Exactly, so it's about 50% of the committees have submitted their report, which means that there is still a lot of work to be done. And they are going to have recess for the Easter breaks. And by the time they resume, the other half, which is another 30, would conduct their hearings before then they get back to plenary and then have a harmonized budget. I don't expect anything, coming out of the National Assembly until end of May, probably.
So might there be, in defense of the Nigerian Parliament now, might there be any positives to a delayed budget cycle?
There is absolutely none.
Because we've been talking year in, year out on how to achieve a year-to-year budget calendar, January to December, and then we keep pushing the deadlines and we keep missing it. Might there be pros to a delayed budget cycle?
Absolutely none. Here is the game. If it were a private sector entity, that is an abysmal failure. They should pass a law that actually keeps the presidency as well as themselves on their toes, meaning that the budget should be submitted before the end of October, and all the necessary things should be done so that first or second week of January we should have a functional budget so that the country can hit the ground running. But that hasn't happened in a very long time. I don't remember when last we had a budget passed in January. From
January to December. Yeah. So two things now are what I see as key issues as regards to Nigeria's budget 2019. Speedy passage is an issue, and then funding of the budget. Funding of the budget
comes with the assumptions. So, for example, we don't go back and look at how we performed the previous year. If we continue to do that, then the assumptions that are put in front of the National Assembly.
The government scored itself 75% on implementation for last year's budget because it didn't borrow as much as it said it would borrow.
That's because they didn't release as much as they wanted to release, because the budget last year was about 1.8 billion in deficit financing. The reason why they didn't borrow is that they didn't release as much capital side of the budget. So yeah, the recurrent has to be paid because that's the bill, the salaries, etc., etc. But on the capital side, it was abysmally poor. The other thing that helped last year was the price of oil. Price of oil assumption was $55 per barrel. The average price of oil last year was $75 per barrel, even though production didn't meet the target. So on line by line, those assumptions need to be checked. And if we do that, then the forecast prediction in October, for example, would be better, and the budget expectation would also be better, and then the implementation can follow.
So talking budget deficit now, one of the key strategies that the government has said it wants to implement this year is to ensure that it achieves lesser deficit than the previous year's budget. And there have been arguments as to whether or not this is realistic or even sustainable if you say scale through at the proposal stage. Are you able to sustain this? And then two key issues will come to mind, like you mentioned, the oil benchmark.
Correct.
There have been analysts who have said, do a downward review. What you have now is not realistic. Where do you sit on that argument?
I think I don't buy the government's argument that there would be lesser deficit financing this year. No, on the contrary, it's going to be reverse, which is that the deficit financing is going to be higher. The reason being that the oil production has not yet met the target. In fact, if you go back 10 years, all our forecasts, budget assumptions for oil production volume on average, we've missed it. So we consistently miss on the production volume.
For last year, we even did an upward review.
Exactly.
Of the benchmark.
But the benchmark price was better, because last year it was assumed that 55 oil prices came out ahead. This year, however, that assumption 60? For the oil benchmark is fine, because oil price may hover around that number, but the production volume will not meet the 2.3 million that was in the budget. We would be lucky if we produce at 2 million barrels per day.
And
average
we also have to
throughout
consider
the
the OPEC restrictions.
Correct.
So there is subsidy to talk about, Bukar. The IMF has said take off subsidy. The budget makes provision for subsidy. The government has said we cannot take out subsidy unless we tell Nigerians what to do and how to navigate the challenges that would come with the removal of subsidy. To cut deficits, maybe taking out subsidy is a way out.
I thought when Mr. President won this second term, he warned Nigerians that we should brace for tough times, right? I thought he was meaning that there might be some discussions about energy pricing to bring it back to market rate. Subsidy is a very expensive proposition. Subsidy is, personally speaking, subsidy is enjoyed mostly by the elites, people with big cars. It does have effect on the average person, but we can, as a nation, sit down and consider palliatives to the people who would be most affected by removal of subsidy. But subsidy on its own is not sustainable, one. It is about 2 trillion naira last year, nearly 2 trillion. I believe it's 1.3 or 1.4 trillion. Now, that can go a long way in putting basic infrastructure, roads, railways, and healthcare, to the extent that if we were to bring the energy pricing, realistically speaking, especially, and also, it's not just fuel, it's not just PMS. We should also consider our light bills. If it is properly fixed, we may begin to enjoy constant electricity.
Very quickly, let me just interject and take your thoughts on two things. The debt to GDP ratio is also an argument with that funding. The Senate says federal government should be cautious of borrowing plans. The Debt Management Office says the books are looking good. And then the government says the debt to GDP ratio must not exceed acceptable levels. What are acceptable levels of borrowing? Very quickly.
For our economy, the debt to GDP ratio on just the numbers basis looks decent, less than 20% or somewhere around there. The problem is the debt service ratio, meaning that the revenue we collect as government and the debt we're paying out every year, it is over 30% of the total revenue that comes to federal government. It goes in debt services. That's not sustainable, especially looking at the fact that we're going to put another 2 trillion naira onto the total debt. The other thing is that the smart things that the DMO is doing now is to look at the longer term bonds, such as the 30-year. If we can do a 30-year or even a 100-year
debt. There are analysts like yourself who say that that's a trap also for the future generation.
It can be.
30 years of debt.
Unfortunately,
It saves us in the now and then cages us later.
Exactly. But we need to spend wisely the money that we're collecting. So if it is to fix infrastructure, education, etc., it's forward and future-looking investment.
Many analysts expected inflation to drop, and it did drop. You said that you thought it would go up.
I thought it would go up because I thought we are kind of going to have a tail end of the spendings from the elections.
And I said maybe that's because the budget has not been approved yet.
And
the money going
exactly,
to the economy.
And the fact that the budget is not released would also definitely have a dampening effect on inflation, which actually truly is reflective of what has come out this morning.
How soon can we meet the one-digit target for inflation?
Well, it's a tough one. Because as the budget gets passed, probably second half of the year, we may have a challenging moves. Considering the fact that the MPR rate was reduced, that could also have
implications for more
inflation concerns,
yes,
but that hasn't shown up. So it looks like we are on the right trajectory.
Thank you very much for your time and thoughts on the show this morning. Kyari Bukar is the former chairman of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group.